Hello everyone, you're all very welcome here this evening to the January meeting, the first of 2023 of the Galway Archaeological and Historical Society. And it's my great pleasure to be able to welcome our guest speaker this evening, Dr. Mícheál Fathartaigh. A graduate of Trinity College Dublin, Dr. Fathartaigh is a lecturer and historian operating in the Social Sciences Research Centre at the University of Galway, also in the Archives of Rural History in Bern, and in the Dublin Business School, so he gets around fair bit. He is also the author of Developing Rural Ireland and of Irish Agriculture Nationalised. Additionally, he is co-author, together with Dr. Liam Weeks, of Birth of a State, the Anglo-Irish Treaty, which examines the treaty's legacy and its implications for the Irish state we inhabit today. And also, he is co-editor, again with Dr. Liam Weeks, on a collection of essays by leading historians entitled The Treaty, Debating and Establishing the Irish State. Dr. Fathartaigh's broad-ranging research and commentary on the origins of the Irish state and the development of rural Ireland has been published and broadcast widely. County Galway is one of 12 county case studies that feature in his latest volume, Developing Rural Ireland, and will be the basis for this evening's lecture entitled Ploughing, a Course for Prosperity, Developing Rural Galway in the Early 20th Century. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Mícheál Fathartaigh.
Good evening, everybody, and thanks sincerely for turning out on a January evening. I know how difficult it is to get into gear at this time of the year. Certainly I'm finding it difficult myself, so I really appreciate such a healthy audience. I hope I can reward your Monday evening endeavour with an interesting discussion over the next 3/4 of an hour or so. Thanks as well to Shane and to the committee of the Galway Archaeological and Historical Society for inviting me to speak. I am a very, very, very proud Galwegian, and nothing gives me greater pleasure than speaking on home turf. As an undergraduate, the first article I had published was in the Journal of the Galway Archaeological and Historical Society, and really after that boon I could have retired, and maybe I should have retired at that stage, but that's another story. So what I'm going to talk to you about this evening is the development of rural Galway from the turn of the 20th century up until around the 1930s. And I'm going to get a second shameless plug in for my book now. Shane has already done the job, but I'm going to back it up by encouraging you all to check out Developing Rural Ireland, which was published last year by Wordwell Books, available in all good bookshops and some bad ones as well. Available in Charlie Burns, and in actual fact tonight, Charlie Burns is having a late opening, especially so that you can go down and buy a volume. So we're just going to have a 10-minute recess now. That should give you enough time to sprint up and down, and then we can get on with the discussion. Developing Rural Ireland was a commission. It was a commission that I was lucky enough to win from Teagasc. And the purpose of the book specifically was to write an institutional history of the advisory services, which of course are today operated by Teagasc. But when I won the commission, I wanted to do something a little bit more ambitious than just that. I mean, that would be a worthy endeavour in its own right. But I was conscious of the fact that it wouldn't maybe have a massive appeal beyond the advisory service constituency. Also, moreover, there was, and there still is, a huge gap in the historiography when it comes to the agricultural history of Ireland. This is something that I am acutely aware of. As Shane mentioned, like a lot of people, I wear a couple of different hats, so I very much work within political history. But the area that I'm most passionate about is agricultural and rural history. And this is partly because I am so concerned about the fact that there is so little scholarship devoted to it in this country, considering that we are, or at least historically were, very much an agricultural society. So you go to the continent, and in lots of countries, Switzerland, Sweden, the Netherlands, to name just 3, there is a very wide interest in agricultural history, but for one reason or another, which we can maybe get into when I'm not being recorded, that isn't the case here in Ireland. So I'm very keen to drive it on. Now, when I say this, I'm very conscious of the fact that in this room there are several very exemplary scholars who have made a contribution in this area: Tony Varley, Gerard Moran, John Cunningham, to name just 3. But what I would really love to see is if we could have some real consistency around agricultural history, and there could be an ongoing and continuous school based around the study of this area. So that's my earnest wish, and if any of you have any pull or sway in that regard in this audience, anything would be massively appreciated. So, as Shane mentioned, Developing Rural Ireland contains, as well then as a history, an institutional history of the advisory services. It takes account, as I was saying, it takes account of the wider story of the transformation of Ireland, rural Ireland, across the course of the 20th century. So as everybody in this audience knows, either consciously or subconsciously, we went from being a relative agricultural backwater at the turn of the 20th century to playing host by the end of the 20th century to a cutting-edge agri-food sector. And that didn't just happen as a matter of course. It required very determined intervention. And I would contend, and this book contends, that this intervention happened chiefly at a very local level. It happened as a consequence of an interaction between progressive farmers, which is to say farmers who are open to improving their farming practices, working in conjunction with proactive agricultural advisors who are, committed to helping them in that respect. So in recognizing that it was very much a kind of a granular transformation that brought about this national progression, I have included in the volume 12 county case studies as well. And needless to say, at the first opportunity, I made sure to give Galway coverage. In that respect, though, I've obviously I've covered 12 counties. More than half of them still need to be examined. And I would encourage everybody in this room, whether you are somebody with a history background or not, I would encourage you, especially if you're not from Galway, to think about doing some scholarship yourselves on the other counties, because we have great source material available that hasn't really been looked at all. So for every county, we should have the minutes of the County Committees of Agriculture, which I'll be talking about in a moment, which existed between the early 1900s and the 1970s. And we have then the printed County Committee of Agriculture annual reports. And they give, in great detail, year-by-year accounts of what was done in every locale, in every county in Ireland, to drive forward the agricultural agenda. And I can't tell you what a thrill you get when you open up these volumes to know, as I said, that you're probably, since they were printed or since they were written up, you're probably the first person to look at them. And you're getting a very visceral sense by reading them about what was done exactly in your areas to bring, as I said, Ireland from quite a parlous state at the beginning of the 20th century to an advanced state by the conclusion of the 20th century. So as I said, there are annual printed reports. These are available widely, but if you want a one-stop shop, the wonderful Department of Agriculture Library on Kildare Street in Agriculture House is a great repository, because they have an almost complete collection of the annual reports, and the librarian there, Paolo De Fant, would be delighted to welcome you through the doors. In terms of the minutes, they were kept at a local level. They tended to be handwritten. And here in Galway, we have these minutes in the Teagasc Centre in Athenry that some people might be familiar with. Now, moving on then. So what exactly took place at the beginning of the 20th century then to get the ball rolling in terms of this transformation that I am stating happened in the 20th century? Well, it all began with this man on your screen here to the left, Horace Plunkett. I'm sure he didn't need introduction to anybody in this room. A very familiar face, synonymous with very good things in Ireland, in rural Ireland, between the end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century. However, I would contend that most people probably associate him specifically with the cooperative movement. And that's what he's, most famous for. Encouraging the development of creameries from the end of the 19th century, and moreover ensuring that these creameries would be cooperative enterprises. And he succeeded to a very large extent. And today we have a massive legacy as a consequence of his promotion of both creameries and cooperative creameries from the end of the 19th century. For better or worse, of course, a lot of them have turned into PLCs, but nonetheless, he has left us a huge bequest. Our dairy industry, I know it's in the news a lot these days because of difficulties reconciling it to the climate change imperative, but it is the jewel in the Irish agricultural crown, and Plunkett played a massive part in the very origins of that. But Plunkett was multifaceted. It wasn't just the cooperative movement that he instigated. He also, again, as I'm sure a lot of you are aware, led a very successful campaign to have established here in Ireland an Indigenous Department of Agriculture. So over 20 years before the Irish state became independent in 1922, we had our own Dublin-based Department of Agriculture. The London government agreed to devolve us our own department for the island of Ireland. And that was as a consequence of the political campaign that Horace Plunkett undertook. Now, it was wonderful for our esteem as a nation to have our own department, but it wasn't simply for optics that Horace Plunkett pursued this. He recognised that if the potential of Irish agriculture was to be unlocked, then we needed bureaucrats here in Ireland to push Irish agricultural policies, specific Irish agricultural policies, not one-size-fits-all UK policies. And he also recognised that in tandem with, department officials formulating policy, recommending policy, they needed to be complemented by people on the ground in every locale throughout the island of Ireland, implementing bespoke agricultural policies. And these were the advisors, okay, or as they were called 100 years ago, the instructors. So Horace Plunkett envisaged this department operating a small army of instructors in all of the 32 counties of Ireland. And that's exactly what happened at the turn of the 20th century. The advisory service was instituted in tandem with the Department of Agriculture and Technical Instruction, as I'm sure a lot of you know that was the actual rubric of the department when it was set up. Now, there were three types of instructor originally. There was the poultry keeping and butter making instructor, there was the general agricultural instructor, and there was the horticultural and beekeeping instructor. So three categories of instructor. And each of the, I was going to say 32, but in actual fact 33 counties, because of course there's that discrimination that Tipperary was partitioned, and there used to be North and South Tipperary. So there were 33 different county teams of instructors, and they comprise these three different types. The poultry keeping and butter making instructors were actually referred to, we wouldn't agree with this nomenclature, but this is what they were called then, instructresses, because of course they were all women. The general agricultural instructor, these were all men. The horticulture and beekeeping instructors, they were also all men. Now, the general agriculture instructor, they were primus inter pares, okay? There's no disputing the fact that they were the heavyweights when it came to the instructors. They were the leaders of the team, and they were responsible for, the most, I suppose, important overarching agricultural endeavours in each county. The horticulture and beekeeping instructors, as their name indicates, they were involved specifically in promoting the development of what we might call kitchen gardens, helping especially small to medium-sized farmers better feed themselves and their families through allocating small plots of land, to the growing of fruit and vegetables, and also, where possible, growing sufficient quantities that they might be able to sell at local markets as well. And also encouraging specifically beekeeping, because at the turn of the 20th century, this was deemed a good way to potentially enhance the value of a small or medium-sized farm to keep bees. But the reason I have my icon for the poultry keeping and butter making instructresses as the largest of the three is because the women were the ones who cut the early dash when it came to the successes of the advisory service. So what was the advisory service doing in a nutshell? Well, quite simply, it was setting out to help farmers to farm better. Okay, that was the simple logic that Horace Plunkett had for the advisory service, and that's what he wanted the instructors to do, to go out and interact with farmers and help them to become better farmers. Because, of course, he was cognizant of the fact that the vast majority of Irish farmers, especially small and medium-sized farmers, and especially here in the west of Ireland, whilst they may have had a vocation for agriculture, they were not by any means agriculturalists. And a lot of them didn't want to hear this themselves, but they needed help to become bona fide farmers. They needed professional assistance. So that's what the instructors were setting out to do. They were setting out to help farmers to farm better. And the poultry keeping and butter making instructresses, specifically, they were sent out to interact with what I might call farming women, farmers' wives and farmers' daughters, who, as I'm sure all of you in the room know, were responsible for a certain amount of activities on the farm. They were responsible for the raising of hens, the collection and sale of eggs, and, where creameries didn't exist, for making butter for sale at markets, either local or even further afield. And these poultry keeping and butter making instructresses, they were to work with the farming women to try to maximize the income that these farming women, these farmers' wives and farmers' daughters, derived from these activities. And they enjoyed precocious success. And that's, as I say, why I have the hen up here writ so large, because the whole purpose of the advisory service was to get farmers farming better, and the dividend from this then would be an enhancement of the revenue stream onto the farmstead. And this would happen in due course when it came to the farming activities in general, but it happened almost immediately when it came to the female enterprises. So as soon as the poultry keeping and butter making instructresses began to work with the women, very, very quickly, the quality of hens improved, the quality of the eggs that they laid improved, the market for Irish eggs, both locally, nationally, and indeed internationally, improved exponentially from the turn of the 20th century up until the First World War. So I'll be talking more about that in due course. But at a time when it's incumbent upon, all of us as historians to rewrite women back into history, my job was made very easy in this respect, because I didn't have to go looking for the way that women made a contribution. It was very clear to me, when I began my examination of the sources, that it was the women who made the immediate impact when it came to the improvement of structures and profitability and sustainability in rural Ireland. Now, the Department of Agriculture and Technical Instruction and the County Committees of Agriculture would be the administrators of the County Advisory Service. So this wonderful picture here from Daniel Hochter's first history of the Department of Agriculture, which has been followed up in more recent years by Mary Daly. Mary Daly's wonderful history of the department, which I would heartily recommend that you read. These two books document the institutional history of the Department of Agriculture, and it was housed originally, as this picture demonstrates, in some of those wonderful Georgian townhouses in Dublin on Merrion Street. The County Committees of Agriculture, they were not a consequence of Horace Plunkett's intervention. They were an addendum to the new county councils. So in 1898, the Local Government Ireland Act was introduced, and the county councils were set up in all 33 Irish counties. And as I said, these county committees of agriculture were set up in tandem with the county councils proper. And each of these county committees of agriculture, they would administer on a daily basis the county advisory teams. So the department in Dublin was responsible for general direction, we'll say, but in terms of the day-to-day operation and administration of the county advisory teams, that was done very much at a local level and was overseen by the county committees of agriculture. This wonderful image here on the right of the screen, this shows a large proportion of the secretaries of the county committees of agriculture who met at an agricultural meeting in County Cork in the early 1900s. Now, you're probably wondering who comprised the county committees of agriculture. And I was shocked when I looked at the source material initially, because it wasn't who I expected. I expected that these people would be, vocational agriculturalists, perhaps, people in various counties who had agricultural qualifications and were best fitted to direct the operation of the county advisory services. Or looking at things more realistically, I expected them to be county councillors wearing a second hat. And that's ultimately what the county committees of agriculture would be. For those of you who remember them, they were institutions where future councillors and indeed TDs would cut their teeth. But in the early days, in actual fact, they comprised, to a very large extent, clerics. Okay, you had a lot of priests and indeed bishops who sat on the county committees of agriculture. Not just Catholic priests either as well. You had Protestant ministers as well. And when I saw this, I was initially struck by the incongruity of that and was wondering how exactly these people could really be what was required to steer qualified agriculturalists. But I have to say, based on my reading of the minutes, they tended to be vocationally minded. They tended, I'm using a very broad brushstroke here, they tended to recognize their limitations when it came to agricultural science, and they tended to cast themselves as facilitators of what the instructors were doing on the ground. So, needless to say, when we think about clerics involving themselves in Irish life, that has often had very unfortunate consequences, is probably the most diplomatic way that I can put it. But in this instance, the reverse is true. By and large, and to reiterate, I am using a broad brushstroke, these clerics served as very worthy administrators, as indeed did the other secular people who sat on these county committees of agriculture as well. It was almost as if, as I said, they recognised that politics, or whatever their other priorities were, had to be left at the door, and when they stepped into the County Committee of Agriculture chamber, they had to focus on whatever was best to nurture agricultural and rural development at a county level. So moving away now from the general picture and bringing it all back home to County Galway, and I hope you appreciate my use of maroon. It took me a few hours on Saturday night to get the colour right in this respect. The County Committee of Agriculture here in Galway was up and running by the turn of the 20th century, and the first instructors, most importantly, were appointed in 1902. So, there was, at the outset, a problem in Galway, and this is something that I'll be addressing over the course of the next 20 minutes. There was, it won't surprise any of you to hear, I'm sure, a conspicuous east-west divide within the county. So Galway, and I say this without prejudice as a proud Galwegian, we are an arbitrary county, it has to be said. To go from the Shannon Callows up to my place of origin in the North Connemara Mountains is really to travel the full gamut of agricultural and rural Ireland without leaving the county bounds. And what's good for agricultural and rural development in Portumna most certainly isn't germane to what's required around Leenane. So there was a problem there right from the very, very outset. Needless to say, and as a Connemara man, I say this with no small amount of bitterness, East Galway came out on top, at least initially. So the instructors that were deployed from 1902, they would be concerned exclusively with everywhere east of Galway City. Now, what gets the County Committee of Agriculture off the hook, a modicum, is the fact that West Galway, or Connemara, was really the responsibility still at this point, it has to be said, of the Congested Districts Board. So the Congested Districts Board had actually been the first official national institution to employ instructors. They were called agricultural overseers within the Congested Districts Board, and they weren't as qualified as the instructors I'm going to be talking about in a moment were, the ones who came on board with the county committees of agriculture. But nonetheless, they were agriculturalists working in the field, and Connemara had already benefited to a significant extent from their interventions, particularly when it came to things like the improvement of livestock. So, for this reason, from the 1900s up until the 1920s, when the Congested Districts Board was completely dissolved, Connemara, West Galway remained the responsibility of the Congested Districts Board, and East Galway was the responsibility of the new advisory service. Nora Keating, a 20-year-old woman from Gort, she was appointed Galway's first poultry keeping instructress. Annie Coyne was appointed its first butter-making instructress. The two roles were, I've been referring to them as one, they were combined very quickly, but at the very outset, particularly in the bigger counties like Galway and Cork, the roles were divided. John Meade was our first horticultural and beekeeping instructor. And then finally, the heavy hitter. In 1906, our first general agricultural instructor, a Cork man by the name of Tim Cotter, was appointed, and he was joined in 1911 by another Cork man, Nicholas Dromey. Interestingly, other historians have found when they look at the bureaucracy of particularly the new Irish state in 20 years' time, that there was something of a Cork mafia at work. There seemed to be Cork people everywhere within the new state bureaucracy, and it would seem that the Cork men got off the ground running in the early 1900s because a disproportionate amount of them comprised the general agricultural instructors, and we certainly were a case in point in that respect. Now, the reason it took so long for the general agricultural instructors to be appointed was because the graduates weren't there at the beginning of the 20th century. So the county advisory services were set up before there were actually qualified general agricultural instructors. Horace Plunkett and his successors were very keen to see that the men who were appointed to this role, and indeed the women who were appointed to the other roles, they were properly qualified. Now, the poultry keeping and butter making instructresses, they would have the Munster Institute in Cork would be their chief place of learning. So that was a former dairy school that was repurposed at the turn of the 20th century, and that's where most of the poultry keeping and butter making instructresses would have trained. The horticultural and beekeeping instructors, they trained at the Albert Agricultural College in Glasnevin, which today is part of the campus of DCU, Dublin City University. But they would be doing cert, diploma-style courses. So the institutions were there to take them straight away. The courses were drawn up quite quickly, and the length of time that it took them to qualify was relatively short. So that's the reason why we had our poultry keeping and butter making instructresses and our horticultural and beekeeping instructors very, very quickly. It took longer to get our general agriculture instructors because they had to undertake a degree. And this degree would be undertaken at the Royal College of Science, which is today, I'm sure you all know, government buildings. The course had to be drawn up, and people had to be processed on 3 or 4 year degree programs. So that is why it took until 1906 for the first agricultural instructor to come to Galway. But it would be easy to make the argument that it was worth the wait. The qualification was, a world-leading qualification at this point in time. And moreover, when you look at what was achieved by the agricultural instructors during the early decades of the 20th century, you can see that in most instances they really brought their training to bear in an immediately lucrative fashion. So what exactly were they doing then? Because I'm talking in a notional sense. I'm talking, I'm saying that they made this intervention. I'm saying that transformation happened. But how did it happen, and what exactly happened? Well, their chief medium for helping farmers to help better was demonstration work. Okay? So these men and women who had been professionally trained in laboratories or in the field, they brought that insight into rural Ireland, and they disseminated that knowledge, that information, by setting up model enterprises, model farms throughout the country. And they borrowed, in doing this, they borrowed on a precedent that had been set by what we call, euphemistically, the gentleman agriculturalists of, say, the 18th and the 19th centuries. So I'm sure you're familiar with the story of the improving landlord. And the improving landlord was somebody who we might call a gentleman agriculturalist, or the improving landlord might have employed one of these kinds of people, amateur agricultural scientists. And they tended to work on the domains of landlords' estates, looking at ways to improve agricultural practices, and then they would demonstrate their insights to tenants on the estate. So the model was established by these people for what would happen then officially and institutionally with the advisory service from the turn of the 20th century. So this image here on the right of your screen, this is from the late 18th century. It's an English image depicting a demonstration event using a steam engine. So this is what they would do. They would set up, model enterprises throughout the counties in various locales, and they would encourage them progressive farmers to emulate what they were doing. They would complement this as well, each of the instructors, by giving lectures and also by, moreover, leading classes, particularly winter classes. Okay, that was obviously the ideal time of the year to work with farmers during the effective off-season. So let's have a look closely then at what Nora Keating did. Okay, so to choose a single individual and look exactly at what she did to improve the performance of poultry keeping and butter making, butter making was Annie Coyle, improve the performance of poultry keeping in East Galway. Now, Nora Keating ended up working particularly with women who were on small and medium-sized farms. Obviously, even in East Galway, that accounted for most of the farms. But there was a real sense that the instructresses, backed by the county committees of agriculture, made a beeline to the small to medium-sized farmers, recognising that any income that could be, any extra income that could be generated could have a massive effect on the fortunes of these small to medium-sized farms. And this quotation captures a very visceral sense of that. The poorest people have hens, Nora Keating observed, and acknowledged they live by them the greater part of the year. I'm sure I don't need to tell anybody in this room how significant egg money was in rural Ireland, particularly in the west of Ireland at the turn of the 20th century. The money generated from the sale of eggs at local or indeed national or international markets might seem trifling by our standards today, but on impecunious small farms, which suffered from a dearth of regular income as well, the constant income derived from the egg money often, literally made the difference between success and failure on these small to medium-sized farms. I was struck years ago when I first embarked on research looking at incomes on small farms in a townland in Connemara called Leitrim Collu in Canton and Illon. And the vast majority of money on these farms was earned from two sources: remittances from the United States and egg money. So Nora Keating, what she did was she went around and she encouraged principally through, I suppose, canvassing. She encouraged farming women, farmers' wives and daughters who were responsible for the raising of hens and the collection and sale of eggs. She encouraged them to take better pedigree hens, okay? Chiefly the white leghorn, okay? Buff Orpington, Minorcas, if anybody's interested in poultry. These were the other birds of choice. And the way she did this was she set up distribution centres. So 5 when she started in 1902, building up to around 10 to 15 by the end of the 1910s. And as we go into the 1920s, there would have been around 35 of these distribution centres around East Galway. And pedigree hens were distributed from these distribution centres. And Immediately, this began to have an effect. Okay, better quality hens produced better quality eggs, more eggs, and this resulted in an small economic windfall then when the ladies went to market to sell their eggs, or in turn sold them on to agents who would sell them further afield. This is another quotation from Nora, which will hopefully give you a sense of what I'm describing here. The chicks of the new variety are well known in the local markets by their large size and superior quality when compared to the small, delicate, inbred chick of the old variety. Everybody seems well pleased, both as regards table and egg qualities. It is gratifying to notice the good-humoured smile of the women coming to market with their well-filled baskets of eggs. And as well as doing something of such local benefit, Nora Keating, unwittingly, I suppose, was also contributing to a new horizon of fortunes for Ireland in general. Patrick Hogan, who I'll talk about in a moment, would be Independent Ireland's first Minister for Agriculture. And he would pursue a campaign to develop Irish agriculture that was configured around improving the quality of what we exported to our biggest market, to Britain, recognising that this would be the surest way of improving fortunes in rural Ireland. And as I say, unwittingly, Nora Keating and her cohort implicitly recognised this in what they were pursuing as well. And evidence of that comes with this final quotation. Goods going to London, not up to the proper standard, would only give Galway a bad name and prevent people reaping the full benefit in years to come. So this 20-year-old from Gort, she showed profound, I would say, insight and indeed foresight in recognising what was right for Irish agriculture. We acclaim Patrick Hogan for his interventions in this respect, but here we can see a woman in his own county was anticipating what he would do on a national scale 2 decades before he would. Now, the First World War intervened between 1914 and 1918. As I'm sure a lot of you know, this was good times in a general sense for rural Ireland, because there was something now of an agricultural boom, an agricultural bonanza as a consequence of the First World War. Britain needed us to be the breadbasket more than ever before. As you know, within the UK, that was our role. Britain was industrial, its workers needed to be fed. They were no longer working on farms themselves, by and large. Ireland was looked to provide food and sustenance for industrial Britain. And that ratcheted up a degree during the First World War. And as a consequence of Britain's necessity, prices went through the roof. So very generous prices were offered to Irish farmers to produce what they produced and keep Britain fed during the wartime exigency. But Britain didn't just need what we were mostly producing at this stage. By the turn of the 20th century, we had become what we are today, a primarily livestock-orientated agricultural economy. So mostly, obviously, beef cattle, sheep, and indeed dairy cows. Britain needed more from us. It also needed crops from us. And we had, as I said, moved away from that kind of mixed farming model. So in order to stimulate a tillage economy in Ireland again, Britain, the British government, controversially introduced compulsory tillage legislation from 1916. So they did this as part of the infamous Defence of the Realm Act. And as we've been reflecting in the decade of centenaries, Sinn Féin would sweep the boards between 1916 and 1918, and we know that was to a very large extent due to the fact that it had taken on the mantle of the 1916 Rising. But possibly a bigger reason why Sinn Féin was endorsed in rural Ireland was because it imposed the Defence of the Realm Act in a general way, which meant that it imposed compulsory tillage. Farmers didn't like compulsory tillage. They had moved away from that. They were making good money, better money than ever during the First World War from the raising of livestock. So when Britain came along and imposed the compulsory tillage orders from 1916, this was met with disdain in rural Ireland. And yet the response was nonetheless positive when we look at the data. So here in Galway, between 1916 and 1917, the acreage under wheat in Galway increased by 62%. The acreage under oats by 50%, and the acreage under barley by 25%. Now, when I've presented data like this previously, and in one particularly scalding incident for me, I presented it to a group of economists, and they rounded on me and suggested that the reason that this happened was simply because the money was offered by the British government, and the farmers followed the money. Okay, but Economics 101 doesn't explain this, because what my learned economic friends didn't take account of is the fact that it's one thing waving money at somebody and enticing them to do something, but if they can't do it, then they can't claim that money. We can't simply turn around to an electrician and say, look, I really want you to be a plumber now, and there's an extra 50 quid in it for you. It doesn't work like that. Anybody with a farming background knows a livestock farmer, a dairy farmer, is a very different animal to a tillage farmer. So the money certainly incentivized the transition that happened here. But what also needed to happen was that farmers needed to be convinced and needed to be helped to become tillage farmers once again. And what was central to the success story in this respect was the relationship between the general agricultural instructors and the farmers. By 1916, a decent relationship had developed between a decent proportion of farmers in rural Galway and the likes of Timothy Cotter, and Nicholas Dromey, and indeed Dromey's successor, a guy called G.C. Kelly. And it was this relationship between these men and the farmers of chiefly East Galway that was a big part of the reason why rural Galway responded to the tillage drive. So we hear a lot of conversation, loose conversation from politicians these days about how Irish farmers need to start growing crops again. All right, and hopefully for the sake of farmers in rural Ireland, it'll be financially incentivized once more. But not for the first time, politicians need to take a learning from history and recognize if they want to do this, then they need to emulate what was done on a practical level by the advisory service and farmers in the 1910s, and indeed again during the tillage drive in the 1930s and during the emergency in the 1940s as well, when there was another compulsory tillage order introduced. Now, following hot on the heels of the First World War was, of course, the Irish Revolution. And what bearing did this have then on the success of the transformation that was beginning to happen in rural Ireland? Well, in actual fact, it wasn't as disruptive as you might imagine it to be. So, during the Irish Revolution, as you know, the revolutionary government, Dáil Éireann, it set up parallel governmental departments. So as well as the Department of Agriculture and Technical Instruction, the British department that Plunkett had established, you also had a revolutionary Dáil Éireann Department of Agriculture as well. It was led initially, the Director of Agriculture initially was Robert Barton, one of the signatories of the Anglo-Irish Treaty, and then his successor, when he was incarcerated, was Art O'Connor, this man pictured on the left of your screen. Now, interestingly, even though this was a revolutionary government, and even though they were not happy about the rate of development in rural Ireland, Art O'Connor recognised the good work that was being done by the advisory service. He recognised the dividends that had accrued from the relationship it had fostered with farmers on the ground. So the department, the Revolutionary Department of Agriculture, actually endorsed the advisory service. Not only did it leave it to carry on with its work, it didn't interfere with it in any way, shape or form, but it endorsed it as something that should be embraced by the Irish Republic, both then and ultimately. Likewise, when the Irish state was established then in 1922, the end of 1922, our first Minister for Agriculture was the aforementioned Patrick Hogan. Now, Patrick Hogan, unlike Art O'Connor, was very much a technocratic Minister for Agriculture. He was an agriculturalist in his own right. I mean, he was a solicitor by training, but he was first and foremost a man of agriculture. I always say this, but it bears repeating. When he was interned in Ballykinler internment camp in Down, he spent his time not learning the Irish language or playing Gaelic. He spent his time reading books about farming, and hats off to him, because books about farming are not easy reads. But this demonstrates to you what a vocation the man had for farming. He was from a large farm himself in Kilreacle in County Galway. Interestingly, his mother, Bridget, had been one of the women who had worked with Nora Keating, and she had been one of the early distributors of pedigree hens in the Kilreacle district. And Hogan recognised again that the advisory service was going to be key to the ongoing and ratcheted up transformation of rural Ireland. That Sinn Féin government, that newly independent Irish government, they wanted rural Ireland to prosper, and they wanted, as a consequence, agriculture to develop. And Patrick Hogan had lots of ideas, some of them, quite revolutionary. In my first book, I looked at how, even though he's seen as a very conservative character, he actually bought out all the proprietary creamery owners because he wanted all the creameries in Ireland to be cooperative. So he was really socialistic in doing that. But looking at the advisory service, like Art O'Connor before him, he wanted the status quo to be maintained. And more than that as well, he wanted to intensify the endeavour. So even though the new state was really quite bankrupt, he managed to convince his colleagues within the new Commonwealth cabinet that money should be allocated not just for the maintenance of the advisory service, but for the development of the advisory service. He wanted to see more agricultural instructors employed throughout Ireland. So Plunkett had envisaged that each county should have at least 2 general agricultural instructors. By 1923, most counties only had 1. So Hogan did what he could to catalyse the numbers in that respect. And he set then the tone for his successors as Minister for Agriculture thereafter. Right up until the 1980s, when there was a lot of talk about, for instance, totally privatising the Irish Agricultural Advisory Service and emulating what Britain had done in that regard. But there was, thankfully, still an ongoing recognition of the role that it played and continued to play in inspiring development in rural Ireland, how, as a consequence, it was too important to denationalise. Now, moving into 1922, things at a local level here in Galway reached something of a critical juncture. We in Galway struck the lowest rate in rural Ireland, the lowest agricultural rate of just half a penny. And this really wasn't sufficient to maintain the advisory service. And the government, despite the largesse of Hogan, was reluctant to keep making special derogations for County Galway. And it looked as if we might even have to partition the county, because it was actually suggested, and it sticks in my craw to articulate this, there were people, shame on them, on the County Committee of Agriculture who wanted to cut off Connemara, okay, and have it rescheduled as a separate county, all right, and just to focus on East Galway. Thankfully, though, it didn't come to pass in that respect. There was enough common sense within the chamber that they eventually introduced a flat rate of 1 penny as an agricultural rate, and the advisory service on a county-wide basis was saved here in Galway. I'm not going to read out this quotation because I realise time is against me, but this is a quotation from T.J.W. Kenny, who of course was the editor of the Connacht Tribune, and it shows you that here's another person, not a politician this time, somebody else, well-placed, an influencer, to use a modern word, in Galway, who recognised the value of the advisory service and knew that whatever we did, we had to find additional money, we had to strike a higher rate so as to protect the advisory service. Such was the good job that it was doing. Now, as I come to the end, I want to hopefully entertain you with something a little bit more light-hearted. County Galway then got back on track. The agricultural rate saved the advisory service. The 1 penny agricultural rate saved the advisory service. But we reached another unfortunate juncture in 1927 when it came to the appointment of a new secretary for the County Advisory Service and the County Committee of Agriculture. The secretary, just to be clear, was the kind of interlocutor between the Committee of Agriculture and the County Advisory team. So he was a very important person. Now, at the turn of the 20th century, these have mostly been administrators, but by the 1920s, they were appointing instructors to this role, and it would ultimately evolve into the CAO, if you remember that term, the Chief Agricultural Officer. That was the beginning of the process towards this position. Now, the County Committee here in Galway wanted to appoint our horticultural and beekeeping instructor, a Mayo man by the name of PJ McNicholas, to the position, but the Department of Agriculture and Technical Instruction objected. Okay, in fairness, they had a process of transparency and they wanted the best qualified person to take on the role, not simply the person that the County Committee of Agriculture deemed was best placed. And they threatened to cut the funding, the central funding, to the County Committee of Agriculture. So needless to say, this spooked the County Committee and they relented. And they had a problem nonetheless, because there was still obviously that portion of the committee that were unhappy about this dictum from Dublin about who should be the secretary of the county. So they came up with the people who wanted to force it through came up with an ingenious approach to getting Bart O'Sullivan approved to be the new secretary. They scheduled a special meeting for his ratification to coincide with the first day of the Galway races, recognising that most members of the committee would be in a clamour to get out to Ballybrit, and whatever they thought about PJ McNicholas, they weren't going to be wasting any time making any representations on his behalf. So poor old PJ McNicholas remained as horticultural and beekeeping instructor, and Bart O'Sullivan became the secretary. So this is actually what one committee member was recorded as saying in the Connacht Tribune. They could have the meeting early, and the members going to the races would not be inclined to talk too much. As a very amusing addendum to all of this, a few years later, I think in 1932, Bart O'Sullivan complained that he could get no work out of PJ McNicholas. I'm paraphrasing here, but he said, "This man will not do what he is told." PJ McNicholas was tenured at that point, and frankly, given the way he was treated, I can't blame him for clearly working to rule, or maybe working a little bit below rule after 1927. So to conclude, how would I characterise the operation, of the advisory service between 1922 and 1932? So just to bring it up, as I said, to the early 30s. Which is when I finished my county case study for Galway. And as I said, I encourage anybody to take on the story from 1932. Well, relations between Galway County Committee of Agriculture and the new state replicated relations throughout the country in that they were both rough and smooth. You had quite a jarring between what Department of Agriculture officials, both agricultural and bureaucrats, thought was good for rural Ireland, and what the county committees of agriculture and the county advisories thought was good for rural Ireland on the ground. And that's a very conspicuous theme when you read the minutes, and even if you look closely in the official annual reports. You notice there's a definite jarring between priorities in Dublin and what people thought was best for rural Ireland on the ground, which in many ways, I suppose, it corresponds with, our political culture as well, in that there tends to be a disjuncture between what the Irish government thinks is good for rural Ireland and what rural Ireland itself thinks is good for rural Ireland. But what made this, I suppose, discourse so alive and so fascinating to historians is that Ireland, since its independence, for better or worse, I would argue for worse, has been a very centralised state. Okay, the government has tended since independence to arrogate more and more power back to it. So the county councils that were established prior to independence in 1898 had a lot more autonomy than they do now in 2022. But the county committees of agriculture stood in stark contrast to this. They managed to keep a degree of autonomy right up until they were disestablished in the 1970s, and a new national administrative framework was put in place, which would eventually evolve into Teagasc. And I think this local model, with the local people, with local expertise, who understood literally and figuratively what was required on the ground, This served rural Ireland and specifically rural Galway very well. Gur mágwith.